Women in Climate is a podcast sponsored by GIB Asset Management and brought to you by The National. GIB Asset Management is a boutique asset manager with sustainable investments at the core of their active investment business. Their belief is working together as one, bound by a common purpose to be a force for performance, a force for better. Find out more at gibam.com. Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Women in Climate podcast series, sponsored by GIB Asset Management and brought to you by The National. I'm your host, Naomi Kerbel, and today we're spotlighting two more incredible women who are leading the way in the fight against climate change and why their leadership is more crucial than ever. We launched this series in Davos during the World Economic Forum, and the theme this year was collaboration for the intelligent age, acknowledging that we're on the brink of a technological revolution that has the possibility to transform our approach to climate action. Since the launch of ChatGPT in 2022, AI and other groundbreaking technologies like autonomous robotics and quantum computing have exploded into the mainstream, reshaping industries and offering new tools to tackle climate change. But while these advancements hold incredible promise, much of the world, especially in the global south, appears to be left behind. This episode will ask, how are these innovations contributing to climate action? How are women in leadership driving the equitable sharing of this cutting-edge technology? Can the pace of innovation match the urgency of the climate crisis? And will these technologies help or hinder the fight against air pollution, one of the most pressing challenges in climate health today? Stay with us as we explore these questions and more with today's guests who are at the forefront of blending technology and climate solutions, paving the way for a more sustainable and just world. Joining me is Jane Burston, Chief Executive of the Clean Air Fund, the world's largest philanthropic organisation dedicated to tackling air pollution. And Francesca Brady, co-founder and former chief executive of AirRated, an indoor air quality certification company helping to create the benchmark for indoor air quality. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
So Jane, if I can come to you first. I know you founded the Clean Air Fund back in 2018, and it was with funding at that point from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of what its mission has been over the past 7 years and how progress is going?
Yeah, absolutely. We set up, like you say, in 2018, and actually there were 6 founding funders that we had at the time, including IKEA Foundation, Oak Foundation, and a group that funded both climate and health work. And so the mission was, and still is, clean air for all. What we're trying to do is tackle the dual health and climate crisis that air pollution poses. I don't know whether you have heard this statistic. It's often used in air pollution news stories that 8 million people a year are killed by or that die prematurely because of air pollution. There's a horrifying new statistic last year that actually air pollution has overtaken smoking as a leading environmental cause for death. So it's huge, and it's also causing really bad quality of life for people who've got asthma, who have strokes and heart attacks and other illnesses associated with it. And at the same time, if you reduce it, it's helping climate change. So I set the Clean Air Fund up to reduce air pollution for both of those 2 reasons, and because it's just a super efficient way of getting more bang for your buck.
Francesca, we think often, or I do, when I think of air pollution, I think of outdoor air pollution. And when Jane talks about those incredibly sad, devastating numbers, 8 million people, and the fact that it's overtaken smoking, I think of it as outdoor, but am I wrong? Why is indoor air quality so important? And what are the effects of poor indoor air quality?
Well, firstly, you're not the only person who thinks about air quality as external air pollution. But we typically, in the UK, particularly in winter, we spend so much of our time indoors, whether that's in your house, in the office, in a car, on the tube, on a train, basically anywhere that's not outside is an internal environment. So it's because we spend so much time there, it has such a huge impact on our overall health that we can't overlook it and only focus on outdoors. And typically that's been where there's a lot of policy and regulation that comes into play. In indoor environments, the responsibility is quite complex in terms of who owns what and who looks after what, that it is just inherently a very underlooked space. So when we talk about air pollution generally, again, you've got the health and well-being impacts. So exacerbated asthma if you're exposed to particulate matter in an internal environment. The really hot topic at the moment is mold, and I would kind of encompass that as indoor environmental quality. So you've got Awab's law that's coming into effect in October this year, and it's about exposure to damp and mold in housing. So you've got all the health and well-being impacts, and then the kind of overlooked one is the economic impact. So businesses suffer financially when their workers are exposed to poor indoor environmental performance, because you have this association with higher levels of CO2 impacting cognitive performance, higher levels of particulate matter pollution influencing risk. So the S&P 500 same-day returns drop when air pollution goes up. Software developers, their output drops when air pollution goes up. It's all these things that we don't really necessarily take into consideration. And as you say, we don't think about the indoor environment quite so much.
And in terms of those overlaps, Jane, that Francesca just so eloquently brought us, there's also this big overlap between climate, energy and air quality. And I know that with your work when you were in the UK government, you were head of climate and energy science. Can you talk to me about why you then chose air quality, despite all of those different things that you were actually focusing on?
Yeah, I can. So, and it was actually two realizations that I had whilst I was in this government position. One was that people do really care about climate change, but it doesn't necessarily change their behaviour most of the time. So the British government for many years, decades, has run a survey about public attitudes to climate change. And for years and years, at least 2/3 of people have said that they're somewhat or they're very concerned about climate change. And they mean it, they're not lying. But then secondly, I was running a team in the British government that calculated the UK's carbon footprint, the inventory. And what I could see was, whilst the UK had been really good at decarbonising the power sector, which is something upstream, we turn on the light, we don't necessarily need to know where it comes from. We hadn't been very good at all at decarbonising transport or our heating systems and the kinds of things that required people to make quite a big change in their lives, buy a new car, install a different heating system. And I was trying to square these two things. Like, people say that they're concerned and yet they're not making changes. And the reason really is mostly because we make it too expensive to do the green and sustainable thing. Expensive, impractical, it's hard. And we can't expect people to always voluntarily pick things for climate reasons. So I started to think, because I had in a different job had kind of come across this interaction between air pollution and greenhouse gases, which is most of the emissions of both are from burning fossil fuels. I started to think, well, if the causes are the same, dirty energy, industry, fossil fuel-based transport, well, the solutions could be the same: renewable energy, more public transport, more walking and cycling, electric vehicles, cleaner industry. Why don't we talk about the health benefits of doing this stuff as well as the climate benefits? And really, the Clean Air Fund came out of the desire to do that, both to get the efficiency of investing in climate solutions that also reduce air pollution for all the reasons that Francesca just mentioned. It's good for the economy as well as for our health and the climate. But also because talking about the health benefits of things will motivate more people than just simply only talking about the climate benefits. And you often find that air pollution is a much less politically divisive topic than climate change. And so it's a more inclusive conversation. More people can understand that fumes are bad, that reducing fumes will be good for my neighbourhood, and more people can kind of understand why certain transition actions are being taken.
Politically less divisive. I think that puts you in the perfect position for the rhetoric that's going around geopolitically at the moment, both of you. Francesca, in terms of the control that people have, how much control do people have over the air quality that they are surrounded by? And then in turn, Jane, I'd love to chat a little bit more about the projects that you've been working on and some of the successes you found.
I think people have more control than they think they do. So if you're in an indoor setting, take the home as a good example. So I might go out and buy an air freshener and a new mattress and all these things that are introducing pollutants to my home. There are little labels that you can look at to make sure that materials have been tested and meet low VOC criteria. So all these little tips and tricks in terms of...
And what did you say? No...
Low VOC.
low VOC, and what does the VOC stand for?
Volatile organic compounds. So basically things you can smell. So that covers such a massive spectrum of things. So it could be when you peel an orange, you can smell a smell, and that's VOCs from the orange peel. But likewise, fresh paint, that smell of VOCs coming off the paint. New car smell, that's always one that really resonates with people, VOCs. So they're gases that are emitted from materials, and they can be emitted over quite long time frames, so months and years if it's a new product. So just knowing that if you were to buy a product secondhand, it's probably released all those gases. You're bringing it into the home, and it's not going to do that when you bring it in. The
Can I
cleaning
just jump
products
in as your and do please pick up that point? But I think it's particularly interesting to talk about this through a gendered lens, because I know that going through fertility treatment, which I did, one of the things I was advised was not to have bleach in the house, not to be around new paint, those sorts of things. So there is a gendered angle to this as well.
There is. And I think probably lots of the advice you received when you were undergoing fertility treatment was explained to you in terms of like, this is the most optimized you can make your health. And you need to have optimized health because of the treatment you're undergoing. In actual fact, most people could do with this advice. You just generally don't want to expose yourself to lots of potent cleaning chemicals. That's not great for you. If you cook with a gas stove, you just need to practice proper ventilation. So switching on the extractor fan, despite how infuriating it sounds, and then leaving it on for a little bit after cooking. But there are so many things that you do in the home, so many activities, so many things you bring into the home, that if you were to minimize the impact of that, you could have a hugely beneficial outcome in terms of your individual health and exposure to air pollution.
Thank you. It's so useful to get some practical solutions and applications. And Jane, sort of taking that a step further, you've given around $80 million worth of grants to more than 300 projects since 2019. It's a huge amount over a short number of years. Can you talk to us a little bit about the successes, to the points that Francesca was making, some practical examples of what's working well? Because I know you're working across the globe.
I think just to build on Francesca's points about control, I think we often think, there's lots of actions that government should be taking to reduce air pollution, because when we step outdoors, we don't have control anymore of the quality of the air that we're breathing. And pretty much all around the world, it's nowhere near the World Health Organization guidelines for what a safe level of air quality would be. But we have a lot more control than we think, especially in kind of campaigning on what we demand of governments. Given that the focus is women in climate, I thought I could talk about a couple of women that we have worked with that are making change on a city or a national scale. Somebody who you might have heard of in the UK is Rosamond Kissy-Debrah, who is the mother of a little girl, Ella, who tragically died of an asthma attack brought on by air pollution when she was only 9 years old. And they lived on the South Circular, which is one of the busiest roads in London. Lots of congestion, big heavy trucks coming by. It's incredibly polluted. And what Rosamond discovered when she was talking to the paediatrician after Ella's death was that of the 28 times that she got hospitalized in the last 3 years of her life, 27 of them were on days where air pollution near their home and the school, which was very close by, was at a very extreme level. So then they discovered that it was pollution bringing on these asthma attacks. Rosamond managed to campaign to get the inquest into the death reopened, and the coroner has written air pollution now as one of the causes of death on the death certificate, which has had huge implications for policy in the UK. And there's lots of people who have been inspired by Rosamond's work internationally. For example, the Mayor of London has said that Rosamond's work has inspired him to put in place the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, which restricts traffic pollution in London. And she's now working on getting better standards nationally for the UK. And then further afield, Dr. Tolu Oni is working in cities like Lagos and Cape Town and Accra to help young people in Africa get a bit more control of their environment by showing policymakers exactly what's going on, how bad the air quality is and where it's coming from. So what she does working with youth groups is she equips them with these new exposure monitors that are quite cheap, you can hold them in your hand, and they go on runs or cycle rides around their city, measuring air pollution as they go, so mapping it on a really granular level in the neighbourhood, and then taking photos of what's producing this high pollution level that I'm reading on my exposure monitor at the minute. Is it that somebody is burning waste by the side of the road? Is it an open drain? Is it a landfill site? Is it that there's a junction where there's always lots of traffic and there's no enforcement of the exhaust from traffic? Yeah, these young people do the measurements, they go and present it to policymakers, and they also present what they think the solutions could be, which really then involves them in policymaking.
Thank you for those examples. Rosamond, Kitty, Deborah and Dr. Toluoni. Really fascinating. And the second one in particular calls to mind some of the work that you've been doing, Francesca, with AirRated. Because I think in terms of indoor air quality, we often think about air purifiers, which, in the case of Ella, wouldn't have been a solution with those sorts of levels of pollution going on. They've been around for such a long time. I mean, I remember my mother having an air purifier by the bed, and that must have been like early 80s. So I'm really keen to understand how technology has moved on. That was such a great example with those exposure monitors. So what other things have you come across, Francesca, that you're particularly excited by?
I would say as a result of COVID, which is the phrase I hate using when it comes to indoor environments. But as a result of COVID, there were a few interesting products that came out of the woodwork. So for commercial offices that have big HVAC systems, so heating, ventilation, cooling systems, you could bolt things on that utilize ultraviolet radiation or bipolar ionization. So ultraviolet radiation and bipolar ionization, which are both methods that are hugely effective, but the byproducts of the interaction of these systems with air pollution is not particularly well understood. So it was the introduction of all these like novel technologies, novel solutions, but because it was a knee-jerk reaction, nothing had been tested with any rigor in particular. So I think there's always a little danger with that. The more fun, quirky items I've seen actually on IKEA are the air pollution curtains. So they've been coated in a kind of mineral layer that interacts with air pollution and breaks air pollution down into less harmful byproducts. You get paint that does the same thing. So there are a couple of brands on the market. And again, when you paint them on the wall, they act as a chemical barrier, interact with indoor air pollutants, break them down. All of these things are amazing, but they're more about the marginal gains. So they're not doing anything hugely impactful because the surface area of your walls versus the volume of air in the space is a fraction. So I would say that the novel solutions, the tech is coming on leaps and bounds in terms of the monitoring side of things. The practical solutions, I would say your mum with her air purifier is absolutely on the money. I have an air purifier that tackles both particle pollution and gas pollution. So I live on a main road and I've got an air purifier with a HEPA filter and a gas phase filter. So basically just two levels of purification. One of them is for the particulate dust matter and then another for gas. So again, not something that you would necessarily know as someone who wanted to introduce an improvement into your indoor environment, but just is a helpful solution to tackle two pretty big fundamental issues in indoor settings. And then I'm kind of a fan of the organic approach anyway. Like just don't mess with it too much. Don't zap it. Just clean it.
Don't zap it, just clean it.
Yeah.
Tip. In terms of data in particular, so I'd like to sort of take it on a little bit. I know that a lot of the Clean Air Fund's work involves monitoring those pollution hotspots that you were talking about before. And you've created OpenAQ, is that correct?
It's one of the organisations that we funded, yes. We didn't set it up. But
funding, and that is the world's largest free open source air quality data platform. Tell me a little bit more about how that data collection and monitoring is helping you map how things can be adjusted, tweaked, where maybe even some of your investment is going and some of the projections for the future.
There is a very disparate access to air pollution data around the world. Some countries it's very visible. I travel a reasonable amount to New Delhi because we do quite a bit of work in India. We have an office there. In all of the hotels, the AQI, the air quality index is there visible in the reception. It tells you what the level is inside, to Francesca's points about air purification and how good it is. And you can find out on your phone very easily what the air quality is outside. and you can sometimes see how bad it is. In other parts of the world, you can find it out if you go looking on government websites. Sometimes it's hard to find. The data is there, but it's buried on a government website, or it's in an inaccessible format that, if you want to do a bit of analysis, you can't. Maybe it's on a PDF. Maybe it moves around on the government website and you can't frequently find it. In a lot of countries, there just is no monitoring. So we know that in Africa, for example, out of 52 countries, only 10 have any monitors. So there's lots of different things that could be done about that. One is get access to the data that already exists. And so OpenAQ is a website that volunteers mostly have written APIs to draw in data from the monitors that do exist in the world, so that all in one place you can access a map of the world with real-time air pollution data that you can compare from city to city or country to country, or look at your location at any given time and see what the pollution is. And it's hugely valuable because then it can equip people who, like the individuals that we heard of before that want to campaign for change, to understand what the level is in their country and how it differs in different places. Another thing that OpenAQ has been doing is supporting ambassadors, especially in global south countries. I know you mentioned that in the beginning, where air pollution is often worse and where access to data is also often worse, to access this data to lobby for new equipment and to use it to try and get policy change.
We've been talking a lot over the past few weeks with the advent of DeepSeek. I'm wondering, Francesca, in terms of use case for AI in improving air quality, do you see that? Do you see that as something that's going to help tackle the climate crisis?
Without a shadow of a doubt, yes. I think, and speaking in terms of indoor environments, with all of the technology that exists, it's all brilliant as long as the solution is end-to-end. In my previous role, what we saw was a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, so occupiers in buildings, were saying, okay, as a duty of care to our staff, we want to do something for air quality. So they would buy sensors. So then we'll get the data. And then what? Because they didn't have anyone specifically who understood the context behind the data. But if you have machine learning, big data, AI, algorithms galore that can bring that to life better and say, if this and this at this time of day and with these conditions, we assume this is what's happening, and here are a couple of recommendations to introduce into the workplace, introduce into the home, I think that's going to be massive. And I've seen a system that has a sensor that goes on the air intake for a building and then sensors inside the building. And it connects to a building management system, which is basically like the brain of a big commercial building. And that can alter ventilation rates. So if air quality is deteriorating outside, the building shouldn't be sucking in the same amount of air as it was when it was clean. It should ramp down. And then you don't want to compromise the indoor environment, but as long as you're looking at it and you're monitoring it and managing it, then it's great. And then what you get, to Jane's point about this intersection between energy and air quality, is saying, well, because we're doing such heavy monitoring and we're making sure it's meeting a minimum criteria, what we can do is lessen the energy consumption if we're able to dictate the ventilation systems. So yeah, I think technology, big data, machine learning, AI, whatever brand you want to put on it, is going to be hugely important.
Jane, your response to the AI debate, obviously we can't escape it, and it's shaping the way we do business. What are you seeing as the upsides and the downsides in terms of air quality and the work you're doing?
So a major upside of AI is that it could help to fill the gaps in some of the monitoring. Lots of countries can't afford to do it because the regulatory grade monitors can be very expensive. And the lower cost monitors that are now coming online can only do so much. So AI is great at filling data gaps with other sources of data, like the small amount of air pollution sensor data that we might have, but plus the weather, plus building density, plus the amount of traffic that there is, and then forecasting what the pollution will be so that people can make decisions based on it. Do I go out tomorrow because the forecast is that pollution is going to be high because the wind is blowing in pollution from elsewhere, or there's no wind and there's going to be a lot of traffic? So it kind of brings sense to lots of different data sets where we don't have the ideal amount of monitoring. I think on the downside is the huge amount of energy that it uses. There's lots of data centers involved in processing these massive data sets. It needn't be powered by coal or fossil fuels. I think renewables like solar and wind can significantly reduce the carbon footprint. And we've seen with DeepSeek, for example, a much more efficient way of using the models that's less energy intensive that might be on the horizon.
Francesca, earlier Jane was talking about ULEZ, the ultra low emission zone in London. And you could say that London has been at war with pollution since the 1950s, you know. And I remember reading and writing about pea supers. So there was the Clean Air Act that was passed in 1956. And as we were talking about more recently, the city has put in this ULEZ scheme. In terms of the next big policy push, is there something in particular that you're advocating for?
What I would advocate for, because of my background, is definitely something indoor air quality specific. So auditing, inspection, assessment of internal spaces, both in the public and the private sector. So at the moment, the private sector do it as a duty of care exercise. In the public sector, that's where you need regulation and policy really to whip everyone up to standard. And I think we have rolled on ahead with making our homes and our buildings increasingly airtight to make them more energy efficient, but completely overlooking the quality of the internal environment. Exactly. We're all trapped in with it. I think we need to be looking at it, because what we do is we make sure fire systems are up to scratch. We will test water quality, make sure there's no Legionella in the water. But the one thing we don't really look at is air, and it is quite strange. And I think it's because we can't see it. But then if you introduce data, obviously you're making the invisible then visible. But without it, it will be difficult. So I think this kind of indoor air quality audit, in the same way that with your car you would have an MOT every year, why wouldn't you have a building MOT? So I think that would be incredible to see. Beyond that, I think it comes back to renewable energy, because whilst I think the rise of electric vehicles is amazing and that reduces traffic emissions, and then ultimately that has a good impact on the internal environments, the source of the electricity is problematic at the moment. So I think there are some solutions out there that are great. I mean, there's one company that has solar-powered EV charging points for the home. Amazing, but there's not a huge amount of that going on. So I think a holistic approach to policy, one, I would love to see more for internal environments, and then something for renewable energy as well.
And it's worth saying on electric vehicles too, something that isn't frequently talked about is, whilst obviously there's no tailpipe emissions and air pollution, there is air pollution, particulate matter coming from brake wear and tyre wear. So it's not like it's a complete solution. You know, we're still going to have particulate matter even with electric vehicles. So if we can shift to more sustainable public transport, have fewer vehicles on the road, that's an even better solution.
To that point, because that feels like a very first world problem that we're talking about. And my sense is that the work that you're doing, Jane, is much broader than that. You're looking, as you were saying, at the global south and beyond. When air quality is not seen as a priority for those in particular living on the breadline, and when the funds aren't available for monitoring, how do you engage policymakers in making change around this?
It's a really good question. And I think that we've seen globally, actually, countries get to a certain stage of development and a certain level of pollution that has gone hand in hand with that. And it's at that point that the population have had both their awareness raised, because usually the pollution is at levels that you can see it, and their concern raised to the extent that they then start to tackle government about it. And we need to start to tackle it earlier, because otherwise we're going to pursue these development pathways that are very heavily polluting, and they're actually really harming economies. There's a huge economic negative impact to air pollution that nobody talks about, which is, I mean, they talk about the health impact. So there's an economic impact of the health impact, the cost to the national health system and social care of treating the people who got sick because of air pollution, of which there are many. But there's also a business cost in productivity. Francesca was talking about, you know, if there's so much pollution, whether it's indoor or it's coming inside from out, you can't concentrate, or you can't even go to work or go to school in the first place, because you're off work sick with whatever illness that you've got from air pollution or that's been exacerbated by pollution on a given day, like asthma. In the UK alone, that's 3 million working days every year that could be saved if we just reduced pollution from the current level to what the World Health Organization says is a reasonable amount. In more polluted parts of the world, that's significantly more days. So I think the story that is not being told often enough to policymakers and especially finance ministries globally is the story about how much it's costing you and how much cheaper it would therefore be to invest in more sustainable infrastructure up front and not go through this very polluting development pathway that really hampers people's economies because of the reduction in productivity.
Francesca, final question, if I may, to you. I know that you're off to start a new venture, and I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that and also some of the lessons that maybe you've learned from AirRated that you're bringing to it.
So it's a perfect segue, Naomi, a perfect segue, because the new venture is around personal exposure to air pollution. So before, when I was at AirRated, it was a purely B2B company. So we would go to landlords and organizations and perform air quality tests and then certify spaces. That was brilliant. And we would absolutely tie in this kind of economic impact of, if you do this and you can identify quick wins and make the space better, then it's better for business. That was always the angle that we had to play on, because it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough just with the health and well-being benefits. So I was at AirRated and I was doing this and loving it. But then I was part of a social housing study that took monitors into people's homes. We got them more familiar with the data, introduced some interventions, and people really connected with these devices to a point where they asked if they could keep them at the end of the study. I was like, I don't have a say in that, unfortunately. Otherwise you could. But I think when I saw that, I was like, right, okay, there is so much more that can be done on an individual level. And whilst it's brilliant that businesses are adopting it, I do feel like it's quite a slow burn, but I think ultimately businesses will get there because it is beneficial for them. But on an individual level, I think a lot of people feel helpless, which I hate to see. And this whole misconception about not having control, people just need the education in order to understand that actually they can do something about their personal exposure. So the new venture is tackling that to say, again, on an individual level, inherently, we kind of just want to know about our own personal profiles. Like, I take a certain route into work. And what does that look like in terms of my exposure? And what does it mean? And what can I do? Because those are the two things that I want. So we need solutions that can be in people's hands on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, that bring the data to life, because it's so abstract. You can't see it. No one really gets it unless you work in the space. But it's something that we know how many steps we take, and we know so much about nutrition. And then air quality is such a fundamental part of our health, and we're just overlooking it. And I think if people understood the data, got familiar with the data and comfortable with it, changes don't cost anything. It's like walking on the inside of the pavement rather than curbside will actually benefit your exposure to air pollution. It doesn't cost you anything. And then hopefully these things will be subconscious, the changes you make to your lifestyle. Yeah, and they don't cost anything. And you can buy an air purifier, or you can just try and ventilate your space better. So yeah, that's what the new venture is trying to tackle, is air pollution on an individual personal exposure level.
And Jane, in reaction to that, putting data into the hands of the people to act, do you have a follow-up? Do you have a comment in terms of how that chimes with what you're doing?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea because people need to feel agency over it. People need to understand the data, have their awareness raised about what it's doing to them, this air pollution, how it's affecting their health and the health of their kids, then be able to make changes in their lives and also advocate for the changes that we need to see in the country as a whole. I think the sorts of things that Francesca talked about, walking your kids on a different, maybe a back street to school, it might be worth an extra 5 minutes if it's taking you to an area where the pollution is cut in half. And then there are changes that you can't make for yourself that I think when people are equipped with the data are much more ready to go to governments and advocate for. There's an amazing group called Mums for Lungs in London. It's parents of all genders, actually. But they do things like this. They look at exposure, they look at routes to school, and then they also go and advocate with their local MP and petition government to make the kinds of changes that we need to make the sustainable choices, the easy choices for all of us.
And we've seen that actually locally in my community around schools, the restrictions in terms of cars being allowed access to schools during drop-off and pick-up times, and you get fines if you go into the areas. So really interesting. Thank you for bringing up that example. And thank you to you both, Francesca Brady and Jane Burston. That wraps up today's episode of the Women in Climate podcast series, brought to you by GIB Asset Management and The National. A huge thank you to our guests, Jane and Francesca, for sharing their insights and for the work that they're doing. As we've heard today, the innovations reshaping our world hold both promise and challenge, especially in ensuring that these breakthroughs reach everyone. The women leading this charge are not just changing industries, they're changing the future for us all. If you've been inspired by today's conversation, don't forget to share this podcast with your network and continue to support and amplify the voices of women who are making a positive impact on the planet. And as always, stay tuned for more episodes of Women in Climate, where we'll continue to celebrate and elevate the extraordinary women leading the charge for a sustainable future. Thank you for listening. Until next time, let's keep pushing for change, because the planet can't wait. GIB Asset Management is a boutique asset management firm that provides a diverse investment offering across the risk-return spectrum, in equities and fixed income, alongside their treasury business, which aims to provide effective and bespoke solutions. GIB Asset Management is based in London with an AUM of $6 billion as of December 2024.